Well, thanks for coming back one more time. As Mick said, there will be the Why Hegel thing in April, and the format still of that is still up in the air. But it's not going to be a full dress lecture, and it is going to be some kind of exchange, either between me and a respondent and you, or just amongst us or something. So this is the last of these full dress things. I'll also just warn you, there are a lot of slides in this. They'll be going by fairly fast. There's a certain amount of material that I believe I simply have to get through to get to the point, and I hope it'll be interesting. So architecture has figured throughout these lectures, sometimes in highly specific ways, sometimes as a more general condition in need of address, and sometimes rather cryptically in ways I haven't particularly paused to clarify. So I want to start off by doing that. On Hegel's account, architecture is art in its incipience, the forms it finds making themselves adequate to an essentially inchoate content, and thus it most fully finds its independence in the moment Hegel calls symbolic. And the sense of the word symbolic there is above all linguistic. So, as he puts it in one of the lectures, now the symbol is prima facie a sign. But in a mere sign, the connection which meaning and expression have with one another is only a purely arbitrary linkage. In that case, this expression, this sensuous thing or picture, so far from presenting itself, brings before our minds a content foreign to it, one with which it does not need to stand in any proper affinity whatever. So in languages, for example, the sounds are a sign of some idea, feeling, whatever. Therefore, when symbol is taken in this sense as a mere sign with such an indifference between meaning and expression, we may not take account of it in reference to art, since art as such consists precisely in kinship, relation, and concrete interpenetration of meaning and shape. Architecture is then, for Hegel, our first plastic response to the confusion set in motion by the discovery that the language we speak is, in its arbitrariness, materiality, and lack of discernible relation to some apparently separate shape of thought or meaning, groundless. That architecture in its prime instance finds form for inchoate content means it is essentially grossly underdetermined by program, to the point that it's better said to constitute a demand for program than a realization of it. We cannot, in the case of this symbolic architecture, as we can in the case of classical and romantic kinds, start from specific forms, for example, the house. For here there cannot be cited any explicitly fixed meaning, or therefore any fixed mode of configuration as the principle which in its further development is applicable to a range of different buildings. So you might equally say that architecture in its rawest form is a demand for objectivity. That is, it's a demand that there be objects, that there be peoples, that there be practices, a demand that things enter into articulation. This means Hegel doesn't think of architecture in its independent form as in the first instance a matter of shelter, but of measure, of establishing or finding or securing a ground. So it's best exemplified in menhir fields, in labyrinths, in processional concourses, sequences of columns and colossi, that are often also supports for writing, with which they share a fundamental arbitrariness and concern for measure. What Hegel calls independent architecture, architecture in its first and dominant moment, looks like anything but what we would now associate with a phrase like pure architecture. Architecture in its independence is in part distinguished by its heterogeneity, its way of being not so much one thing as one thing after another. It's thus immediately and indivisibly an individual art and an imagination of the arts in their multiplicity. Both things simply happen together. We pass from this independent architecture to the classical temple, understood as a further and, as it were, more outward expression of a central artistic unity within a sculpted pantheon, each member of which functions as a center, and then to a Christian architecture expressive of the complex dialectical and systematic unity of the Trinity. Romantic architecture is the dialectical repetition of architecture in its symbolic independence, and so we see both a resurgence of the processual, although now inseparable from a vertical axis that transforms its measure, and we see also a resurgence of the multiplicity of the arts, now neither subordinated to the centrality of sculpture, nor simply continuous with the architecture, but appearing in their systematic differences over and against a distinct, now architectural context. The Gothic cathedral, in its refusal of any, as Hegel puts it, fixed and expressed difference between a load and its support, prefigures the shape of Hegel's system, a writing of philosophy that begins in its own midst and is secured only by its finally closing back round on itself, in marked opposition to the presiding Kantian architectonic metaphor, the one that was in place for philosophy when Hegel's career begins, that had imagined philosophy as supported on a preliminarily secured foundation. Load and support are in effect architectural transformations of the concern with subject and predicate that I've returned to so often in these lectures, and that can help underline how deeply the question of measure and autonomy, of having or finding one's own measure or the measure of one's words, are at work within Hegel's account of art, and so also something of why measure, whether in the emphasis Hegel places on meter in his treatment of the speculative proposition in its proximity to music and lyric poetry, or in the insistence of notions of sight and measure in, say, Richard Serra's practice, or in Smithson's worry that art might just become one thing after another, has been another insistent note in these lectures. Heidegger, who I've mostly kept out of these lectures, can be quite good on this, particularly when he's writing about poetry. He writes, "This measure taking not only takes the measure of the earth, G, J, G, and accordingly it is no mere geometry. This measure taking has its own metron and thus its own metric. Man's taking measure in the dimension dealt out to him brings dwelling into its ground plan. Taking the measure of the dimension is the element within which human dwelling has its security, by which it securely endures. The taking of measure is what is poetic in dwelling. Poetry is the measuring." I think Heidegger is really there in a very Hegelian mood about architecture and poetry. For Hegel, as I've repeatedly noted, there's no shape to thought outside of language. The general job of thought in this respect is not to get clear of what is arbitrarily imposed on it, but to discover that arbitrariness as the actual means of its fullest expression. That's the ultimate burden of the way he works through the history of art, and the outcome of that history is not that we are delivered from language, but that we find ourselves at home in it, which is to say we find ourselves capable of meaning what we say. Now, the largest general claim of these lectures, that contemporary art is explicitly and necessarily built out of art's ending while also being everywhere haunted by its incipience, might now be dramatically put like this. And if we emphasize the impossibility of the classical at the center, we wind up with a diagram that can remind us of aspects of Lacan. Like Lacan's diagrams, it offers to show both something historical and developmental, reading in a very general way, sort of from upper left to lower right, and the overall mapping of a particular structure. I'm not interested in giving this a closer Lacanian gloss. I think the reason what the diagrams have in common is their rootedness in Hegel and not anything particularly Lacanian. But I do think picking up that resonance is suggestive in thinking about how a certain turning of modernism within itself, of becoming explicit about its own complex ground, might be worth calling a postmodernism. And as I mentioned last time, that's the kind of position advanced by Lyotard and Rosalind Krauss, and that should, I think, be sharply distinguished from a postmodernism that comes after modernism and is our freedom from it. So that's the underlying shape of architecture as it's figured in these lectures. We get closer to the more specific ways it's cropped up in them, and so to what holds together the actual field of the contemporary, if we add one more modification to the diagram. And this is, of course, meant to register the way in which the minimalist specific object emerging in the place of sculpture stands at the problematic center of the field I've been exploring. What we would now want to say is that minimalism constitutes, in one of its aspects, a certain discovery of architecture. Indeed, I think this may be the best way to grasp its actual force. This thought is implicit in Fried's remarks on the necessary situatedness of the minimalist object, its explicit dependence on the gallery. It's also, you might say, symptomatically registered from the outset by the emergence of the corner as a site for and active element in a wide range of minimalist and post-minimalist work. It's played out in interesting longer runs where, for example, performance artists like Vito Acconci or Dan Graham find themselves at various points in their careers working in an essentially architectural idiom. Minimalism's architectural entanglements take the form, in the first instance, of an engagement of the specific space of the gallery, and so can also be, and more or less immediately are, taken in as engagement with an array of institutional facts most often summarized by the term the art world. Warhol's Brillo box is, of course, also open into a reflection on the art world. But you might say the art world you discover along Warhol's route is initially metaphorical and sort of finally sociological, whereas the art world discovered by the minimalist object is first of all concrete and architectural, such that the successive steps of its unfolding importantly include Thomas O'Doherty's critical account of modernism's favorite expository space, the so-called white cube. This is one of the major illustrations to that bit of writing, and the repeated return through the minimalist cube in the work of artists associated with the rise of institutional critique. Hans Hacke, who I guess will be on the plinth next week, is that right? Is perhaps a usefully strong example here. All that's pretty sketchy and general, but I hope it's enough to offer a kind of preliminary justification for beginning an account of Peter Eisenman's architecture from the minimalist cube taken as an architectural problem. Here we'd want to say, if for Richard Serra, the presence of the minimalist object in the gallery means that anything that is to successfully assert itself as a sculpture will have to do so by both acknowledging and defeating its architectural circumstances, so for Eisenman it means, as if conversely, that genuinely architectural space will now have to be discovered and asserted against the background of the endlessly reflexive cube that now stands as both work and circumstance. It's as if what Eisenman sees in Die and other works is a simple setup, sheer containedness, one cube within another, each asking the other to render it visible, and neither able to claim that task for itself, thus also unable to think their actual relatedness to one another. And he seems to understand this as a consequence of the hollowness of those two cubes, So his initial architectural task amounts to a sustained exploration of the ways in which a cube might render itself articulate, might break itself out of either mute and impenetrable uninhabitability or sheer self-echoing emptiness. While hollowness is, on Hegel's account, radically at odds with sculpture, that is, of course, not the case in architecture. So the exact characterization of this hollowness is itself part of Eisenman's problem. And what Eisenman most often calls the void figures in his theory and practice as the term pitched precisely against, and so also to some degree an acknowledgement of that hollowness. This same general refusal of hollowness seems to me to deeply shape a number of Eisenman's most fundamental architectural practices. For example, the impulse in much of his drawing to downplay the difference between interior and exterior, as well as his strong preference for axonometric projection. One gets the clearest, I think, summary view of how this plays out for him in the early houses. In these very systematic experiments, the cube is taken not as something with an interior, but as a material form to be pulled through, divided, or turned against itself along one or another axis. House 3 is maybe particularly explicit in this respect. The fundamental commitment is to matters of articulation rather than containment. The space that matters to these houses may be three-dimensional, but it's not in the usual sense of the word anyway, volumetric, or it is so only because it is first of all metric. That is, they in effect ask the cube to take the measure of itself by placing it at odds with itself. In House 6, and again still more explicitly in, it's hard to know how to pronounce these, Find Out House, the built form is the trace of a cube dragged, as it were, diagonally out of itself. And what this discovers for Eisenman is a particular concretion of the difference between a cube and itself, what he calls the L cube, which Eisenman then takes up as a kind of fundamental architectural unit for the subsequent House 10 or X, which shuffles L cubes around its titular axis, and its equally punning sequel, House 11 odd, where an L cube is pulled through itself I guess that's the right description, to generate the structure. These punning fragmented titles that show up periodically throughout Eisenman's work underline his own interpretation of what I've called metric as more particularly syntactic, that is, as a matter of the breaks and measures constitutive and so potentially transgressive of properly linguistic sense. Eisenman's own theoretical writings tend to oppose semantic to syntactic very much as I've opposed volumetric to metric. The underlying spatial thought appears to be of the primordiality of difference, and more specifically of something like a knot, a moment of irreducible interference by virtue of which there is space at all. The L cube is the minimal abstract architectural form of such a knot, at least for Eisenman it is, and its implicit argument is that space never resolves itself outside of a geometry class into the vanishing ideality of a point. That it might do is, one might say, a sculptor's dream, or at least it's closer to a sculptor's dream. The implied critique of the minimalist cube as an act of architectural imagination is that in withdrawing always towards its infinitely recessive interiority, it fails to make sense of its actual exteriority, fails its own measure in syntax, articulates no space. This is Eisenman's first public commission, the Wexner Center for the Arts at The Ohio State University. To say that Eisenman's early work, the houses I just showed you, posits space as a primordial knotting is to say that there are always threads lying around because there's always been a prior knot. The Wexner Center, which is clearly a leap beyond the houses, is perhaps well thought of as the tying of a more complex and specific knot out of the threads found lying around on its particular ground. I seem to have dropped a slide here somewhere. Moving closer, this line appears more accurately described as a cut, slicing off bits of the two buildings it doesn't quite fit between, and visibly biting into the ground. It is a building to be descended into before working one's way back up the long ramp that opens on one side to the Wexner's 4 gallery spaces. The line one most easily registers on the photos and the one that defines the galleries are not, in fact, the same. The first is the open lattice covering of a ground-level walkway between the Wexner's galleries and the adjacent Mershon Hall, while the ramp runs alongside it underground. The processual dimensions, so densely folded into the various translations and rotations of the early houses, are now fully unpacked and wholly explicit. And it's probably worth noting that Hegel takes subterranean building to be independent architecture's first step towards the classical demand for enclosure and shelter. The logic of Eisenman's plan becomes most easily visible by considering the central area of the Ohio State University campus on which the Wexner sits and to which it belongs. We see here in red, in the lower left there, the oval, which is Ohio State's version of the central quadrangle that so often defines a college, and which is here, as in many places, crowned by the library. The red axes register the overall grid that organizes the campus. This grid is clearly distinct from the blue one that organizes the city of Columbus, and that difference is presumably part of an effort to establish the university's autonomy in relation to its larger context. The longest blue line on that plan is not mine. The others, things I added on, but that's Eisenman's. It marks the extension of one axis of the city grid across the campus, where, interestingly, it just touches on the football stadium that certainly plays a far larger role in defining Ohio State's actual presence to the world than does its library. Eisenman's choice of site evidently declines centrality and the most obvious forms of monumentality in favor of something more oblique and subterranean that sets up no easy symmetry of art and knowledge, in favor of undoing the distinctness of the boundary between the university and the city. There was a competition for this building, and everybody else who entered the competition located their version of this gallery to be dead opposite the library at the other end of the oval. Right? Eisenman was the only one who sort of twisted the site this way. So the Wexner Center for the Arts is made up out of the interplay of these two grid systems, with some further complications that are introduced by a loosely archaeological axis at, so to speak, right angles to their plane, and which relates the Wexner to an armory that formerly stood on its site. This temporal dimension has to do with some other things Eisenman worked out with the L cubes that I have not got time to go into. The play between these two grids carries on throughout the Wexner at a variety of scales and levels. It shows up one way even in the detail of the door pulls, another way in the lighting system. There are hot lights on one grid and cool lights on the other grid, in the inclination of the ramp, which repeats the angle of deviation between the two grids, and so on. The Wexner is designed with the same general disregard for program as the houses, right? I mean, those houses were clearly not built by an architect thinking how you wanted to live in a house. That was not in the forefront. So while the Wexner means to be more or less adequate to the general demand that it be one thing, a gallery, rather than another, a house, and have some kind of general distribution of spaces that would let it do that, it takes as little interest as possible in coming up with solutions for the gallery as a specific set of problems or demands. At this level, it's perhaps most easily described in terms of its refusals, and indeed the sort of client rhetoric that Eisenman put out at the time was very much in terms of what the Wexner was not going to be. In particular, it was not going to be a form of the white cube, and it was not going to be a version of the classic art museum as first laid out by Schinkel in Berlin, and which continues to serve as a major template for a great many museums. Schinkel's building, with its central rotunda reserved to sculpture and its timelessness, and the history of painting then unfolding in the successive galleries around it, looks in many ways a lot like Hegel's theory of art. One of the curious things about Hegel is that he never seems to mention this building, which is being built as he's giving his lectures, and not because he was not interested in shaping institutions. He was deeply involved in creating the university that in many ways responds directly to the shape of the museum. Noted back in the first lecture what Daniel Buren made of the Guggenheim as a kind of peculiar reshuffling of Schinkel's claims. In considering the Wexner, we need to see how Eisenman, taking the white cube as a cube with a cube at its center, will have seen it as a particular way of emptying the art museum that would be ordered not to some presiding classical form and achievement, but to mere vacancy. And this vacancy is far from anodyne. The white cube's lesson, as O'Doherty draws it, is that in it either everything is art, or art in its distinctness becomes unshowable. In the white cube, the difference between the space in which a curator might exhibit work and the works themselves dissolves. And I think in the years since, the progressive steps of that dissolution are easily traceable from early conceptualism through the curatorial art of figures early on like Fred Wilson and Mark Dion, down to contemporary redescriptions of work/exhibition under rubrics like platform and station, and so on. The specifically curatorial question that emerges from this history is, I think at its boldest, whether or not the showing of art is in fact possible now. And that's, I think, a good way to locate the specific challenge the Wexner is to its content. Someone will, I think, want a sharper sense of the building's particular demands, at least as a space for the public exhibition of art. And the best way to get that is perhaps to consider shows where those demands become visible just by being interestingly met. So, first, a consideration of the spaces in the Wexner, and then I'm going to go through a couple of shows. The Wexner has essentially 4 galleries, 3 of which open onto a ramp that runs the length of the building, and one of which stands as an essentially separate and approximately square room at the bottom of that ramp. So A, B, C, D roughly indicated. As you can imagine, plans for this building with the ramp are difficult to get one that is really clear and readable. But I hope that gives you some sense of how the galleries fall out in the building. The first gallery you come to along the ramp, Gallery B, is one of the more obviously difficult of the Wexner spaces. It's a long, fairly narrow triangle. And the wall along the ramp side of it goes from a height of maybe 1.5 feet at the narrow end to about 8 feet at the point where it's interrupted by a wide opening directly onto the ramp. There's a distinctly secondary entrance, which I'm showing you on the left here, at the pointy end. It goes by this very narrow staircase. Another such staircase runs from this gallery to the next, and that's repeated one more time at the far end of Gallery C. Those are what I've marked with the orange there. And that's the building's notorious dead-end staircase. It ends in a small window onto the entrance to the Wexner's underground performance space. That intermittent run of staircases forms a sort of chiasmatic mirror to the large beam that runs through all 4 of the galleries, and most prominently through B and C, that runs parallel to the ramp, right? So these 2 axes. Throughout the Wexner Center, the variously scaled lattices that partially wrap the building drop columns at intervals that appear irrational or at least not readily legible in terms either of support or of the interior shapes of the gallery. You can see here, I think on the left, well, in both of these slides actually, in B, there's a sudden dropping of columns right near the wall, making a very funny kind of space if your job is to imagine hanging things in there. And you can see also in these slides the two grids that inform the building reappear in the play between wood and stone flooring throughout. And in the case of this particular gallery, it helps produce a sense at the wide end as it's constituting a sort of discrete pocket to the right of the entrance, and to the left of that entrance, it tends to underline the contrast between the two waist-facing walls. And that too becomes a real problem when you're putting work in it. The floor is really very active throughout the building. Gallery C, the next one down, is a large room, heavily punctuated by columns. It has its own version of the ramp wall problem in B, big sloping ramp wall along it, which also carries across the bottom of the gallery, you can't quite see that here, into an overlook on B below it because you're going up the ramp. At the opposite end of the gallery, there's also a significant drop in ceiling height. It just suddenly comes down a whole lot that often leads curators to make a distinct room there if they can. The ramp essentially ends at the far end of C and opens into the large final gallery that occupies the full breadth of the building. This is now fully above ground. It's most fully exposed to light, both from the curtain wall that runs alongside the ramp and from its own end wall, as you see here. So that's just a quick tour of the basic layout. Helen Molesworth's 2005-2006 exhibition, Part Object, Part Sculpture, advanced a complex argument about Duchamp and Duchamp's legacy. It claimed, roughly, that the 1935-41 Boiton valise signaled a certain willingness on Duchamp's part to receive or reappropriate his own earlier work that was then explicitly played out within his own production, both in his authorization of several sets of remade works in the post-war period and in his making of Étant Donné and the various objects adjacent to it, most notably the so-called three erotic objects. Molesworth argued that what appeared first time around as Duchamp's renunciation of painting was then secured second time around as sculpture, or at least in relation to sculpture. And that this transformation then informed a significant range of contemporary and subsequent work by a number of artists. So the show meant to reopen questions about Duchamp's relation to European art and about his influence on much of the work we now call postmodern. Among the artists represented in the show, in addition to Duchamp, were Manzoni, Bourgeois, Rauschenberg, Twombly, Johns, Hess, Kusama, Brotes, Gober, Gonzalez-Torres, and others. Without going into the show in any greater detail, I want to simply draw attention to two sequences of works that first appear in their distinctness in Gallery B, where Jasper John's light bulb sat across from several of Robert Rauschenberg's Tivoli personality from 1954. These Tivoli personality, which I think have not been widely shown before, belong to a distinct object the show took in cases of one kind or another. Beginning in Gallery A with Duchamp's Boîte en Valise, continued in Gallery C by Marcel Brote's Valise avec Alphabet, and ending in Gallery D with a handmade Robert Gober suitcase, untitled, that opened through its graded floor into a constructed sort of rocky, watery landscape that in general, and certainly overwhelmingly in the context of the exhibition, recalled Duchamp's Étant Donné. So these four works were almost precisely on axis with one another, and that axis is the one that runs right along the ramp wall. The Johns light bulb, on the other hand, opened an axis that was then extended by two Gonzalez-Torres works, untitled North and untitled for Stockholm, Let's see, I've got them going up there on the left. Before finding its terminus in the last gallery in Josiah McElhenney's large chandelier entitled An End to Modernity. And that axis is the axis associated with the staircase. So the suitcase axis was strongly governed by the boîte en valise and the crucial place it occupied in part object's historical and theoretical argument. The light bulb sequence answered more quietly and with less argumentative explicitness to the bec de gaz, the gas jet, that appears and reappears from Duchamp's earliest work to the very end. It seems fair to say in a rough way that the suitcase axis constituted a loose meditation on exhibition and interiority, while the axis of lights carried a more specific meditation on sculpture and its problematic centrality. The two axes together circumscribe the conceptual and physical space in which the show's argument or object unfolded more largely. There's a good bit more that could be said about the underlying curatorial intelligence that informed the particular placement of works throughout the galleries, but I hope I said enough to draw a moral of sorts about what these spaces can reward when their difficulties are actually met. They encourage and reward articulation as such. They make the stuff of spacing and interruption, punctuation and repetition count. It's in these terms, and these are importantly terms not simply of visibility, but of legibility. They make the space readerly. It's in these terms that curatorial surface and placement is secured. So part object, part sculpture seems to me the work of a curator exercising real intelligence with and against a strong and complicated architecture. And in making smart use of the building structure, it did a lot to show what that building is and what it rewards. But that's not quite the same as demonstrating what the architecture does or what it might be said to think. And for that, I think we need to go one step further. So I want to look at another show in the same space. Throughout the autumn of 2006, what functions as the de facto entry or title wall at the Wexner Center, the wall that faces you as you come down the stairs into it, was wholly occupied by the single image of two framed works resting on felt pads and turned face to the wall that they are photographed as leaning against. The photograph belonged to and in effect announced the second of the three shows that occupied the Wexner's galleries that fall. It was an exhibition of the work of Louise Lawler from 1979 to the present, entitled, but notably not entitled on this wall, Twice Untitled and Other Pictures, parentheses, Looking Back. Although the primary reference of the parenthetical looking back is evidently to the show as a retrospective, one can't help noticing that the untitled pictures in this photograph are themselves looking back, that is, their face not forward, but the other way. And at the same time, the photo, as all photos do, is facing us, and the paintings it shows are themselves arguably looking back, making of themselves something like two eyes opaquely returning the viewer's gaze. This entry piece is in many ways a typical Lawler work. It's a notably blunt and frontal photograph of works of art in a particular institutional situation. It's also not entirely characteristic. It does not, for example, display her standard sharpness of focus. So the labels on the back of the work are rather unusually for her, not wholly legible. If you get up and sort it out closely, you can see they're both González-Torres works, but it is certainly not directly given to you in the way she usually does. It's as if the suppression of the words one expects to find on a title wall has been continued into the image itself in some way. And this may be somewhat surprising given the widely shared sense of the essentially and sort of relentlessly discursive nature of the institutional critique with which Lawler is often associated. The show's title does, of course, show up eventually on the ramp wall at the entrance to the show proper, which occupied the middle two galleries, B, the narrow triangular one, and C, the one just beyond it. The visitor's immediate assumption that the large image in the lobby was in fact twice untitled turns out not to be quite right. That image is the uncropped original from which the 2004 piece, Twice Untitled, derives. All this play with title and announcement opens into a further play of relay and repetition, or more exactly near repetition, that runs throughout the entire show. So we have, and I'm just going to run through quickly the most obvious instances. The pair hung side by side, sentimental, unsentimental, or another pair, this time hung apart from one another, here and there, or the pair of more clearly distinct photographs of one of Flavin's monuments for Tatlin seen through a Kuhn's vacuum cleaner display. Sometimes these pairs are presented as diptychs of a sort. For example, here's Nipple, which has two elements separately subtitled on their mats. The piece on the left is subtitled, Does He Get Enough Attention? And the one on the right is subtitled Nipple, thus joining loosely up with a line of differently structured word and image diptychs that also we find the first of these two images hung in such a way that if you enter the show by the small stair next to the title wall, and you're strongly invited to in this case, you have to turn around to see it. And as you move further into the gallery, you encounter one of a number of paperweights that oblige you to turn back again, both physically but also in time, since it shows the same end of that gallery as it appeared in part object, part sculpture a year earlier. I hope you can make that out in the slide on the right. Most of the new work in Twice Untitled was made at part object, part sculpture. So we have, for example, a table at that show's opening set in front of its title wall, and that work itself is repeated in black and white, smaller elsewhere under a different title in Twice Untitled. We have the I will find that slide for you. That picture of the Gonzalez-Torres lying on a quilt in front of a Wexner wall is itself hung on the Wexner wall with its seam lined up so as to match the seam on the wall, but moved one unit down the wall. I hope that's a clear description, and I hope the slide will show up as I go along. Finally, here, an image of a Kusama awaiting installation that has been both photographically cropped and then physically cut so as to line itself precisely with the edge of the wall on which it then hangs. Beyond the Kusama piece here, we see both the other Flavin Kuhn photograph and a photograph of HVAC units awaiting installation in the Wexner Center. That itself is again nearly doubled elsewhere in the show. If we come back to that stretch that had the Flavin and the HVAC on it and look at that wall as a whole, we see it bracketed, in effect, those images bracketed by two pieces. One, a photograph of a large stela reflection on a shiny gallery floor. That's the one on the left there. And the other, a picture of a Gerhard Richter waiting hanging, and itself is hung in such a way as to cast a strong reflection on the Wexner's own shiny floor. The Richter in question here is Emma descending the staircase. In the show, the Lawler photograph here hangs next to that dead-end staircase that I mentioned a while back. And of course, the Richter carries its own reference back to Duchamp in the context of this show that is in various ways also repeating art object, art sculpture. Stella has himself a rather distinct presence in the show. He shows up in that photograph we just saw. He shows up in two of these paperweights that are placed through the show. The second of these paperweights forms its own pair with one of Lawler's best-known early images, arranged by Donald Marin, Susan Brundage, Cheryl Bishop at Payne Weber, Inc., New York City, 1982. So that's a sense of how visually the show wraps around and through itself. It could be extended by saying a bit more about Lawler's texts and titles, and I'll just say a little here. In general, these bits have become significantly more mobile over time. Sometimes they appear outside the work on the gallery label. At other times, they appear internal to the work, embossed on the mat or something like that, or more directly as an element within it. These bits and pieces migrate easily from work to work. They often can't be sharply distinguished from captions or comments. It's as if they belong to a larger writer practice in which they move through and across the image or the means of the image's presentation, and sometimes even strike out on their own. So they, in their own way, extend the work of repetition and relay that I've been trying to sketch for you. So what are we to make of all this? Working through Twice Untitled this way has the general effect, I think, of placing Lawler more squarely in the midst of the appropriation artists with whom she first showed at Metro Pictures in the early 80s, and so of softening or blurring the association with the broader project of institutional critique that first brought her work to prominence. This looks increasingly like a kind of false rhyme, or at least partial, sense that her procedures and Hans Hacke's are deeply similar. I'd say her board of directors, piece at the top, is not doing the work of Hacke's Manet project. And I think this becomes particularly clear when one sees it in the broader context of Lawler's work. Where Hacke is interested in how one system is framed by, concealed, or contained within another, Lawler is above all interested in what touches on what, in the separation and contiguity of things. This is what her pictures overwhelmingly focus on. It's the interest they take in their own edges and the shifting of those edges in her near repetitions. And it's the interest the photographs repeatedly find in their curatorial separations and adjacency. Edges count for Lawler. The work is made to an extraordinary degree out of the contingent encounters those edges inevitably register. If we take her presiding interest to be more simply in frames, whether real frames, the metaphorical framing of institutions, and so on, we miss the actual dimensions of the work. We don't, for example, see how a picture of a curator's hand on the wedge of chastity finds its way into it. But we do get that in focus when we see that it's all a question of what touches what, and of what the shape and consequence of such touch might be. There's a thought not just about framing institutions, but about art at work here. A thought of art showing itself as everywhere edged, and so one might say both self-possessed and permanently exposed. It's a thought about the intermittence of art's times and places, and it's a distinctly photographic thought as well, making itself out of photography's particular ways of cutting into and out of the world. Something's gone very wrong with the slides here. Twice Untitled and Other Pictures was bracketed at the Wexner between two other shows, which were all supposed to be on this slide and aren't. Frank Stella, 1958, which was curated by Harry Cooper and Megan Luke at Harvard's Fogg Museum, and Shiny, which is another show put together by Molesworth that, in a very light way, sort of explored shininess as a feature of contemporary art, and see a bit of that. That's shiny, kind of facing the end of the Louise Lawler show. It's perhaps a general consequence of Eisenman's processual architecture, the parade of galleries A, B, C, D, and more certainly, I think, a specific consequence of Lawler's interest in contiguity and relation, that these shows find themselves figuring into any sustained effort to come to grips with Lawler's work. The sequence of shows, Stella 1958, Lawler, Shiny, might be taken, and indeed in some sense clearly was, as an historical sequence. You could imagine that the wall that divided the Stella paintings down there in Gallery A from the rest of the work, Lawler and Shiny, as almost a physical emblem of the difference between a kind of modernism and a postmodernism distinct from it. At the same time, it was hard also not to be struck by the progression from the weight and the sort of matte presence of Stella's painting through the high gloss of Lawler's photographs and museum boxes to the nearly weightless play of surface and reflective image in Shiny. And it was funny, because sort of coming back down from Shiny to the Stella, the sense of sort of sheer stuff by the time you hit Stella was really quite striking. But I think in the long run, what you found yourself grappling with in the end was a contrast between two distinct models of selfhood. One in which self-consciousness appeared as a form of self-reflection, and another one in which it appeared, as it does in Hegel, as above all a relation to otherness and to limits. A difference then between self-consciousness conceived as a further layer of consciousness, as if the product of a mirror added to consciousness, and self-consciousness conceived not as something superadded to consciousness, but as what consciousness discovers that it must have been all along in order to be consciousness at all. That is, it discovers that it had to be self-shaped. That is, discovers it had to be related to another. What is self-shaped in this sense is at once autonomous and bound to limits that can only ever be acknowledged and perhaps transformed in that acknowledgement, but can never be simply or definitively overcome. The first of these models of self-consciousness finds one particularly explicit and notable artistic and critical expression in Robert Morris. The second, I think, is what's worked out in Michael Fried's writings as they follow Stella's work from the ambiguity of the black paintings, which can in effect go either way, to the clarity of the shaped canvases that follow. That's all very quickly, too quickly said. Many of the crucial arguments are implicit in what I've already explored several lectures ago of Hegel and Fried on experience and self-criticism. They're also implicit in the critique of minimalism that is run throughout these lectures. I think it'll be no particular surprise that if I return to Lawler's work, my claim is going to be that her edges, the ones within her photographs, the ones at the borders of her photographs, and all the others edges those edges serve to make visible, just are Stella's limits, returned through the complex and divided history they partially enable, and they return fully freighted with all the contingency and exposure that photography can bear, which includes the contingency of the work showing with Stella and with the artists of Shiny in Eisenman's Wexner Center. Twice Untitled touched the Wexner's architecture far less systematically than part object, part sculpture did. And it matters that what it did was touch that architecture. These touches are at once contingent and integral to the way Lawler works. They're functions of her edges as they meet the Wexner's demand for articulation. The roles of architecture, curator, and artist are clearly intimately intertwined and yet I think remain actively distinct all the way through. Twice Untitled remains an exhibition of Lawler's work alongside two other separately curated shows. At the same time, that work and Eisenman's architecture each take the measure of the other as they jointly think the instituting of art from within the terms of its late modernity. They render a complex measure, then, of the shifted ground that I've been calling this time. Thank you. Sorry, some of those slides, as they were lined up over on the right, they looked right, and as they came to the left, elements of them dropped out. So I hope you got most of what was there to be seen. That's the rose from the last of the lectures in the fall. And Hegel's the rose. Here is the rose, here dance. Yeah, that was my snappy ending. Animation and everything. Questions, comments? I hope that was followable. So a lot of stuff to go through.
With the grid of Eisenman and Wexler,
Yeah.
this is a shifted grid, staircase and a ramp. I think that's correct. The two axes of Wexler.
Yeah.
Follow that. Yeah. Which brings to mind the Savoy staircases and the processions and sort of But the question more is, there's a lot to unpack with this lecture. I'm not sure I'm really able to process it at all, but the sense with Eisenman of using the cubes, inhabiting cubes with cubes, shifting axes in terms of like the plan, but also this kind of axonometric projection obsession, which all kind of relate to minimalism. I'm thinking Solar Whip very distinctly with permutations of the cube, etc., etc. And I think the one thing I'm trying to grapple with is that are you making the sense of the way the art object part, the Duchamp show is curated, and how the Lawler works, that the response to this really difficult space.
Say the last part of it.
The response of the curators to the website, which is a highly problematic space, isn't it? You would know, you did as painting there. It is a nightmare, actually, for the spectator, but really interesting. kind of suggesting that when curators or Lawler engage with that, I'm sure you seem to be saying that that's unpacking something else. It's giving the possibility to actually engage with a history, a temporal moment.
Yeah.
Is that at the centre of this in some respects, especially with the kind of the question of where the minimalism and object-based projections, for example, Eiseman stand within all of this?
Yeah, let me try and take some of that in parts, because I jumped from the houses to the Wexner. And you might say, when I'm doing that, in a sense, the houses are to explore the sense in which minimalism is a problematic architectural practice for Eiseman and how he addresses that. So that's sort of one question. As I move to the Wexner, I hope I've sort of made clear the general underlying logic of Eiseman's kind of architecture. And I'm shifting over to the question of its being a gallery, right? Of its being a space for the display of art, and what kind of space it is. So I'm not sure I can give one answer that flows across both of your things. But what I want out of the houses is the thought that those rotations and translations of the cube in itself, the sort of almost Rubik's cubiness of those houses, is an attempt to get the cube away from being a container into being something that is capable of sustaining articulation. And then the Wexner pulls that out processually, right? Shows that that's been the stake in it all along. Right? That's the link between those two things. So that's one bit, and there I want to play. Clearly, Eisenman wouldn't be doing that were it not for Dye, Lewitt, all those minimalist cubes, but he is working against their logic, working to free up something different that can become an architecture. Then the question about the space for the showing of art. You have the two models in the background. The white cube model, which is the model both locked into place and in a certain way emptied out by minimalism. And on the other hand, the museum, which in the Schinkel model seems very much to follow the most straightforward version of Hegel possible. You know, there's the timeless center to art, and there's the historical thing that parades around it, and that's a kind of whole. And it's against those two that one wants to sort of understand the Wexner as an art gallery. And one's given the general proximity here of Eisenman's kind of architecture to the sort of symbolic architecture. Architecture not in its purity, but it's in independence. Right? Architecture as the privileged form for the expression of inchoate content. So now the question is, what is content in the Wexner? How does it work as a gallery? And this for me was very hard. I started out trying to talk about Eisenman just by talking about architecture. And somebody pointed out to me very smartly that I wasn't going to get there that way. You had to be able to talk about what it did when it had art in it. And then you had to start, and sometimes what it does when it has art in it is the curator puts up walls like crazy to make the space more normal, and the architect doesn't do anything. Other cases, you arrive at a kind of compromise between what you see as the demands of the work and the difficulties of the building. There are 3 shows actually in it that I thought were particularly interesting with the architecture, and I sort of skipped over one by Jeff Kipnis called Mood River, which simply set itself up, and Kipnis was Eisenman's big early on theoretical champion, but it sets itself up completely over and against the building. If you think of the building as Derrida, which you can in some ways fairly enough, this was Deleuze, and they just put them together and dealt with it. But the two that I did focus on, one of them, you might say, takes what the building gives you by way of overt structure and uses that as a way of rendering its object legible to you. And that was, I think, very smart and interesting, right? To see the show as opening between the sequence of light bulbs, the sequence of alleles, right? Each of those axes being a description of Duchamp in a way, and the show as what's stretched between those two axes. Very interesting, very smart, very nice use of the building. But it also doesn't, I think, and it shows you something about what that building is, that it's not a building for visibility, it's a building for legibility. If you know how to punctuate well, you can work with it, which is actually my own experience of it as well, in a very different, less smart show, but that was what we had to learn, was how to work with the building's capacity for punctuation. I think the Lawler brings out more. It answers much more strongly to the architectural demand for articulation, for the rendering of an object. And it does so because of the nature of Lawler's own practice. So that's what I hoped that last part was bringing out. A kind of capacity for the building that is not simply its usable structure, but what becomes thinkable in it. Right? A content that meets its demand for articulation. So that's sort of where the argument meant to be. Am I answering you?
Does that connect with the earlier lectures focus on creating sentences rather than just one thing being after another?
Well, it all does. I mean, that's, yeah, absolutely.
The eligibility of that.
Yeah.
Using that.
Yeah. And of course, a part of what is this way, that show in that building manifested itself in its capacity to read not simply itself, but its adjacencies. That it has the capacity to read Shiny and Stella. That's deeply interesting, right? And the kind of thing that Schinkel's Museum doesn't do, the White Cube certainly doesn't do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I was going to ask how the Stella worked out. How did the Stella function in that?
How does the Stella function?
Yeah, you didn't describe how that, but I would have thought, yeah, that would be a kind of axial catastrophe.
Sorry, you took the microphone away.
The Frank Stella show, you didn't go into how that functioned in that space. I would have thought that would be a conundrum which would be fascinating.
Well, my focus was on how the Lawler was working. So, its capacity to reach out and read its adjacencies that interested me. The Stella show was down in Gallery A, which is basically the most straightforward gallery in the place. I mean, if you have a choice about where you're going to hang paintings, you're going to hang them there. And it functioned very much like a painting show in that space. And I don't think by itself there's that much interesting to say about it. It was a well-hung painting show in a space that was not overtly hostile to it and didn't pose any particular difficulty. Then it found itself, as it were, further articulated by another show within that building. That seemed to be deeply interesting.
Columbus is Eisenman's city as well, in the sense that he did two conference centers?
He did a convention center as well, yeah.
Which is, that came after the Wexner, or was it before?
Came after the Wexner.
How does that relate to the grid? Does that just go downtown and follow the grid? Does that talk to the
It's playing a different game. It's a related game because it it turns out, the airport's got a grid too, convention center, people flying in and out of town, that gets into the mix. So it has the same kind of weaving together of threads on different grids. It's a little different, it's a little later, and it is myself, I'm extremely fond of the Wexner. I think it's a remarkable, interesting building, and I spent a lot of time with it and grew quite fond of it. But I am not necessarily in the majority there. The convention center has been successful by every standard anybody wanted, and it is a marvelously lucid building, despite being Eisenman playing grid games with each other. So it's a very different kind of thing. Yeah, it's many of the early houses are actually near where I live now, and I have not seen any of them, which is very frustrating.
Yeah, I was going to ask about whether when you did that overview of, the architecture from the start, that the implication at the end was that the white cube is Egyptian, is symbolic, because it doesn't have any articulation.
Huh.
And that Eisenman is romantic. In fact,
Eisenman, I'm definitely going to call romantic, although one who is pushing up as close to the symbolic, in a sense, as he can. So that the Wexner is a sort of, this is going to sound funny when I say it's going to give rise to all the wrong images, but it is a romantic reworking of Luxor, if you want. I mean, it is procession, it is all of that, but it is articulate in a different way. I think what one wants to say is that the minimalist cube, and architecture in general, of course, is the form best suited to the expression of inchoate content at every level. And that's why these questions of content become so sort of tricky, and I'm not sure I've handled them well. But I think he thinks minimalism as being a form of the architectural temple. That is, the thing that claims to be an expression of the sculpture at its center, except it cheats. It passes the showing back and forth between the architecture and the claimed content, which reveals itself over and over again to be empty. But in that sense, it's not different from the Schinkel.
I mean, that's Eisenman's view.
That's Eisenman's view, yeah.
But I was wondering,
It's what I'm claiming as Eisenman's view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you're saying. But I was thinking that, when you said that, whatever you put in the white cube, is either all art or not. That's that kind of possibility for articulation. It doesn't demand it anyway. Yeah. So it's kind of blank.
Yeah. And that's why that Anastasi picture from the Odority is, in some sense, the crucial one. That's.
But in some ways, it's also like some of Lawler's pictures, isn't it? Because especially in her reproduction of pictures of part sculpture, part object, there's the kind of mise en abîme of showing part of the architecture in the place where it was shown before. So there's some.
Yeah, and that's. I mean, this is to me the difficult, interesting part of the argument, and very hard to put well. One way to put it, and I'm trying to tug this back towards those closing remarks about self-consciousness and how we imagine it, right, is mise en abîme, right, means, I think it's originally a heraldic term, right? If you did something particularly cool, you got to place your coat of arms at the center of your coat of arms, right? And the standard modern example, at least in the States, is the Morton Salt girl, who is carrying an umbrella on the outside of a cylinder of Morton salt and carrying under her arm a cylinder of Morton salt on which you can make out the Morton salt girl carrying, right? And the question, you might say, is whether you now go on to say, and so on all the way down, which is the idealist interpretation of the Morton salt girl, or you say, you know, and then a blob of blue and yellow and it's over, right? Which is the materialist interpretation of the Morton salt girl. That's the argument. Is Lawler saying, and blue and yellow, or is she saying it goes all the way down? I'm certainly saying she's saying and blue and yellow. But like Eisenman, she's pressing right up at the limit, because that's where the interesting thing is. Well, thank you for the whole long siege of it. And I hope at least some of you come back in the spring and we have a nice conversation. So, thank you all.